The worst part about losing my job wasn't carrying a cardboard box out of the office. It was realizing that by sunset, I had lost my family too. If you've ever discovered that someone's love only lasts as long as your success does, you already know how this story feels. Stay with me, because what happened 10 days later still doesn't seem real, even to me. My name is Ethan Brooks. I was 31 years old when the company I'd worked for nearly 8 years announced another round of layoffs. By noon, my employee badge no longer worked. By 1 o'clock, I was sitting in my car staring at a severance packet that suddenly made my entire future feel frighteningly small. I kept telling myself it would be okay. People lose jobs every day. I had savings, a solid resume, and parents who always said family came first. I honestly believed I'd get through this. That belief lasted exactly until I pulled into my parents' driveway. Before I even reached the front porch, I noticed two suitcases sitting neatly beside the front door. At first, I laughed because I thought my mother had finally decided to clean out the attic. Then she opened the door, folded her arms, and looked straight at me with an expression so calm it frightened me more than anger ever could. "Those are yours," she said quietly. "It's time for you to leave." I blinked, convinced I had misunderstood. "Mom, I just lost my job today." She didn't soften. "Exactly. Your father and I talked about it. We can't carry you." My father appeared behind her but refused to meet my eyes. He simply nodded once and said, "You'll figure it out. Maybe this is what you need." I stood there holding my office box, still wearing the shirt and tie I'd left home in that morning, trying to understand how one ordinary workday had ended with me becoming a stranger at my own front door. Then my mother said 6 words that changed everything, and I realized this wasn't only about losing my job. Then she looked me straight in the eye and said, "This house can't become your safety net every time life gets difficult." The words landed harder than losing my job ever had because they erased every late night I had spent fixing things no one else wanted to handle. I thought about the winters when I quietly paid the heating bill after my father's business slowed down. I remembered replacing their failing water heater without asking for the money back, mowing the lawn every weekend, driving my mother to doctor's appointments whenever my schedule allowed. None of it seemed to exist anymore. In their minds, one layoff had rewritten my entire value. I picked up the 2 suitcases without another word. My father stepped aside to let me pass, almost like I was a delivery driver leaving after dropping off a package. The front door closed behind me with a soft click instead of a slam, and somehow that hurt even more. Sitting in my car, I stared through the windshield for nearly 15 minutes before starting the engine. I called exactly one person, my college roommate Daniel. He did not ask uncomfortable questions. He simply said, "I've got a couch. Get over here." That simple sentence carried more warmth than anything I had heard all day. The next morning, I updated my resume, sent applications to every company I respected, and forced myself into a routine because routines leave less room for fear. 3 days later, my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another recruiter collecting resumes. Instead, the voice belonged to Melissa Carter, a former client I had helped years earlier. She sounded rushed. "Ethan, I know this is sudden, but I need someone I can trust to review a stack of contracts before tomorrow morning. The entire deal depends on catching anything everyone else missed." I agreed without hesitation. That evening, I opened the first folder on my borrowed laptop, and before I finished reading the second page, one familiar company name stopped me cold. It was my father's business, and the mistake buried inside those documents was already counting down toward a disaster no one in my family even knew was coming. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen, convinced I had to be mistaken. I read the contract again, then a third time, tracing every clause the way I always had whenever something felt just a little too perfect. It was not a mistake. Buried beneath pages of ordinary legal language was a renewal condition tied to a financing agreement. One missed deadline would trigger penalties large enough to push a healthy business into a financial spiral almost overnight. The strange part was not the error itself, it was that I knew exactly how it had happened. 2 years earlier, my father had asked me to reorganize every vendor agreement his company had accumulated over nearly 2 decades. I spent countless evenings sitting at their kitchen table with stacks of paperwork, highlighting deadlines, rewriting filing systems, and creating reminders so nothing important would ever slip through the cracks. My father thanked me once, then slowly stopped mentioning it altogether. Eventually, everyone acted as though those organized binders had simply appeared by themselves. Looking at the contract now, I realized someone had abandoned the system the moment I was no longer around to maintain it. Melissa interrupted my thoughts. "Can you fix it?" she asked. I answered honestly, "Maybe, but only if we move fast." She exhaled with obvious relief, before adding something I never expected to hear. "The bank already contacted them this morning. They sounded completely blindsided." After the call ended, I closed my laptop and walked to the apartment window. Part of me wanted to pick up my phone and warn my father anyway. Another part quietly reminded me that 3 days earlier he had watched me leave with 2 suitcases and never once asked where I was going. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. If they believed I was no longer part of the family, perhaps they also believed they no longer needed what I knew. The next morning, before I had made any decision, an unfamiliar number appeared on my screen. When I answered, the voice on the other end introduced himself as my father's attorney, and his very first question made my heart stop. "Mr. Brooks, how soon can you come in? Your father says there's something about these contracts only you would understand." I thanked the attorney, wrote down the address, and ended the call without giving him an answer. For several minutes, I just sat there at Daniel's kitchen table, staring at the coffee growing cold beside my laptop. 3 days earlier, I had been told I was no longer someone my parents could carry. Now their attorney was calling because apparently there was something only I could do. The irony was almost unbearable. Melissa called again before noon. She had already sensed my hesitation. "You know this isn't just another contract review," she said gently. "If nobody acts today, the bank could freeze negotiations by the end of the week." I closed my eyes. She was right. The problem had already grown beyond paperwork. It had become a clock that refused to stop ticking. Still, every instinct inside me fought against walking back into the lives of people who had shut their door on me so easily. I remembered standing on that porch with 2 suitcases while my father avoided my eyes, and I wondered if he even remembered that moment the way I did. Maybe for him it had been a difficult decision. For me, it had become the dividing line between the life I used to believe in and the one I was now trying to build. By late afternoon, I drove to the attorney's office, not because I had forgiven anyone, but because I needed to understand how bad the situation really was. The conference room was unnaturally quiet. My father looked exhausted, his tie crooked. His shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. My mother sat beside him with her purse clutched tightly against her chest, refusing to meet my eyes for more than a second. Neither of them apologized. Neither of them acknowledged what had happened a few days earlier. Instead, the attorney slid a thick stack of documents across the polished table and calmly said, "Before we discuss solutions, there is one detail about these agreements your parents have never been told." My father turned toward him in confusion, and I realized whatever came next was going to change far more than a single business deal. The attorney folded his hands and spoke with the calm precision of someone who understood that facts could wound more deeply than raised voices. "Mr. Brooks," he said to my father, "for the last 2 years, nearly every compliance deadline your company met was tracked through a system Ethan personally created. After he left, no one maintained it." My father frowned, confused at first, then slowly looked toward the binders stacked on the conference table as if seeing them for the first time. The attorney continued. "The missed renewal was not the beginning of this problem. It was the final domino." Silence settled over the room. My mother shifted uneasily in her chair. "You never told us it was that important," she whispered. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. I replied quietly. "Every time I explained the process, you both said I worried too much." My father rubbed his forehead. I recognized that gesture. He only did it when he realized he had overlooked something he could not undo. For the first time since I walked into the office, he did not look like the man who had ordered me to leave. He looked tired, uncertain, and older than I remembered. The attorney opened another folder and slid several notices across the table. Letters from the bank, pending penalties, deadlines measured in days instead of months. My father's breathing became noticeably slower as he read each page. "Can we still save it?" he finally asked. The attorney turned toward me instead of answering him. "That depends on whether Ethan is willing to step in." Every eye in the room landed on me. My mother reached for my hand but stopped halfway, as though she suddenly remembered she had surrendered the right to expect comfort from me. "Please," she said softly. It was the first time I had ever heard that word from her directed at me instead of someone else. I looked down at the contracts again, and then I noticed one signature page that should never have existed. Someone had quietly approved a completely different agreement after I was gone, and the name at the bottom was not my father's. It belonged to someone our family had trusted for nearly 20 years. My eyes stayed on the signature while the room around me seemed to disappear. I knew that name. Howard Ellis had been my father's trusted financial advisor for almost 2 decades. He came to family barbecues, sent Christmas cards, and had once joked that he had watched me grow up. I slowly turned the page, then another and another. Every amendment connected back to him. Every change had been approved after I was forced out of the company records. My father leaned closer. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I slid the document across the table without saying a word. He adjusted his glasses, read the signature, and the color drained from his face. "That can't be right," he muttered. "Howard would never." The sentence died before he could finish it. The attorney quietly cleared his throat. "We have already confirmed the signatures are authentic." My mother looked back and forth between us, completely lost. "Someone explain what's happening." I took a slow breath. After I left, someone replaced the renewal agreement with this version. It removed every safeguard I built into the process. If the deadlines were missed, the penalties became automatic. My father stared at me with disbelief. "Why would Howard do that?" The attorney answered before I could. "That is exactly the question we have been investigating." He opened another folder and placed several bank records beside the contracts. Large consulting payments had been transferred to an outside company none of us recognized. The dates matched every major contract revision. My father pressed both hands against the table as though the room had suddenly become unsteady beneath him. For the first time in my life, I saw fear replace certainty in his eyes. The man who had always believed he could judge character without hesitation now realized he had trusted the wrong person while pushing away the one who had quietly protected everything. Then the attorney reached into his briefcase one last time and placed a sealed envelope on the table. "This arrived from Mr. Ellis's legal office less than an hour ago," he said. "Before any decisions are made, every person in this room needs to read what's inside." The attorney broke the seal and unfolded the letter with slow, deliberate movements that made the silence feel even heavier. Howard Ellis had resigned that morning. His letter admitted that he had authorized the revised agreements without fully informing my father of the long-term financial risks. He claimed every decision had been made to secure immediate cash flow during difficult years, believing future profits would cover the consequences. Instead, each shortcut had quietly buried another problem beneath the last one, until the entire business was standing on unstable ground. My father read the pages twice before lowering them onto the table with trembling hands. "I trusted him," he whispered, though he sounded like he was speaking more to himself than to anyone else. I looked across the room and realized something even harder to accept. Howard had only been able to make those changes because the one person who questioned every contract had been pushed out. My father slowly turned toward me, his eyes filled with something I had waited years to see but no longer knew if I wanted: regret. "You kept warning me," he said quietly. "Every time you asked me to review another document, every time you wanted another meeting. I thought you were making everything more complicated than it needed to be." My mother finally covered her face with both hands. "I thought you were trying to control everything," she admitted through tears. "I never understood you were trying to protect us." The room fell silent again, but this time it was not filled with anger. It was filled with the unbearable weight of realizing that one wrong judgment could erase years of quiet loyalty. The attorney leaned forward. "There is still one path that may keep the company operating," he said. "But it requires immediate negotiations with the bank, and they have made one condition absolutely clear." He slid a printed email toward my father. My father barely glanced at it before handing it to me. The message contained only a few sentences, but the final line changed the balance of power in the room forever. The bank would only reopen negotiations if I personally agreed to lead every discussion from that moment forward, and my father looked at me with tears in his eyes before quietly saying, "The decision is yours now." No one spoke for several seconds. The silence felt different now. It was no longer filled with pride or resentment. It carried the weight of choices that could never be taken back. I looked around the conference room and realized I could still walk away. No contract required me to stay. No law forced me to rescue the people who had told me they could no longer carry me. Yet despite everything, I could not ignore the years I had spent believing this company represented my father's life work. Helping did not mean forgetting. It simply meant deciding what kind of man I wanted to be. I looked at the attorney and said, "I will lead the negotiations, but under my conditions." My father straightened in his chair, almost afraid to breathe. "Everything goes through me," I continued. "Every contract, every financial decision, every meeting with the bank, nothing gets signed without full transparency. And when this is over, I am not moving back home. I am not returning to the way things used to be." My father nodded before I even finished speaking. "You have my word," he answered quietly. My mother wiped away another tear. "We should have trusted you years ago." There was no dramatic apology, no perfect speech that erased the damage. Some wounds are too old for that. Over the next several days, I worked almost nonstop with the attorney, accountants, and bank representatives. The negotiations were exhausting, but little by little the impossible began to look manageable. Payment schedules were restructured, penalties were reduced, agreements were rewritten with safeguards that should never have been removed. Every evening I returned to Daniel's apartment, sat on the edge of the borrowed couch, and wondered why earning respect had required losing everything first. A week later, the bank approved the final restructuring package. My father quietly slid the confirmation letter across the kitchen table where we had gathered to review the outcome. Then, instead of talking about the company, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the key to the family house, placed it in front of me, and waited for my answer. I looked at the old brass key resting on the table and realized it no longer represented what it once had. A few weeks earlier, I would have seen it as the symbol of home, the place where I believed I would always belong no matter what happened outside those walls. Now it was simply a piece of metal attached to memories that had changed forever. I gently pushed it back toward my father. "Keep it," I said. "I don't need a key to prove I'm your son." My mother's eyes filled with tears again. But this time she did not try to explain away what had happened or pretend it had all been a misunderstanding. She quietly admitted that fear had clouded her judgment. Losing my job had frightened her so much that she convinced herself pushing me away would somehow protect everyone else. My father shook his head slowly. "I spent years trusting the wrong voices because they told me what I wanted to hear," he said. "The one person who kept telling me the truth was the one I stopped listening to. Those words stayed with me long after the company recovered. We rebuilt the business carefully, but rebuilding our family happened much more slowly. We started with small things instead of impossible promises. Sunday dinners, short phone calls, asking instead of assuming, listening instead of interrupting. They learned that forgiveness is not the same as pretending nothing happened, and I learned that boundaries are not walls built to punish people. They are doors that only open when trust returns. I never moved back into that house. I found my own apartment, accepted a permanent consulting position, and built a life that no longer depended on anyone else's approval. My parents visited from time to time, always calling before they came, a small gesture that meant more than they probably realized. Looking back now, I understand that losing my job was never the moment that changed my life. Being forced to discover my own worth was. Sometimes I still wonder how many people have been loved only while they were useful, and if you have ever carried a story like that yourself, I hope you never forget that your value was never supposed to depend on someone else's convenience.